The man, the myth is here. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the roll up. Last couple of days before ECC in Brussels. Looking forward to hanging out with pretty much all of you guys and others and just having a good time. Our last stream. And yeah, welcome to the Modularity meets Chain Abstraction stream. Pleasure to be here with each of you guys. I'm looking forward to kind of talking about this. I've been theorizing a lot, and Rob and I have been talking a lot about kind of why these two things are very important. So looking forward to putting them together and sharing some ideas. Start with some intros. We'll go with Matt, then work to Tabasco, Burnt, and then finish off with Alejo and Arjun.
Sure. Great to be here. Thanks, guys. I'm Matt, co-founder of Caldera. Caldera is a leading modular blockchain roll-up as a service platform. So we help people launch their own customizable, dedicated L2s and L3s on Ethereum. Work with a bunch of chains you've probably heard of: Kinto, Manta, ApeChain, Treasure, 50 more. That means in some sense, I think we're kind of part of the problem here. We're one of the reasons why I think people are launching rollups and the space is getting more fragmented, and also a little bit kind of part of the solution in that we help people find infrastructure providers to work with, including chain abstraction providers. So yeah, great to be here and excited to chat.
Happy to go through an intro on my side as well. So my name is Tabasco. My real name is Ethan. I do developer relations at Particle. I've been doing developer relations for a long time. Previously, I was at an RPC provider for quite a long time, and I've been at Particle for about a year now. Particle is very simply building essentially chain abstraction infrastructure, but specifically at the account level. So we built something called universal accounts, which essentially just allow users to have one balance and one address that spans all chains. So these are smart accounts that are deployed on different, to start, EVM blockchains. It'll be expanded kind of across the ecosystem, but essentially it automatically routes kind of funds across chains and allows the user to pay for transactions using any token from any chain, pay for gas using any token from any chain, and in doing so kind of create this chain abstracted experience at the account level. So essentially giving users the ability to experience applications without necessarily needing to understand or know the underlying blockchain that are being used in these transactions. And so we're working with a lot of other kind of organizations in the space to hopefully, over the next 6 to 8 months, realize this chain abstraction vision, which we believe very strongly in terms of the need and the necessity for this in the space, which I'm sure we're going to get into in a little bit. That's essentially what we're building at Particle. It's just account level chain abstraction, giving users one address and one balance across all chains.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks, guys. And Andy, appreciate you getting this all together. Great group of guys here. But yeah, my name is Anthony. Go by Burnt Banksy online. About 3 years ago, I bought a Banksy, lit it on fire, sold it as an NFT, which was highest average price NFT in most of 2021. Still in the Wikipedia for that today, but kind of been building the aspect of generalized abstraction since then. Just the idea that end users shouldn't really have to go through the barriers of entry that we've set up for crypto. They shouldn't have to understand what chain we're on, and they shouldn't really need to learn all the complexities that kind of come with the industry to realize the benefits of it. So building XION, launching relatively soon, to be able to kind of showcase the benefits of crypto without needing to know all the intricacies.
Cool. Yeah, my name's Alejo. I'm the co-founder of Lumio. We're building a VM abstraction framework for existing L2s and L1s. Essentially, the goal is to enable Solana VM, MoveVM, WebAssembly, some of these alt VMs to work within the frameworks that are popular today, like the Optimism OP stack, Arbitrum, Nitro, so that teams can essentially integrate into the interop layer that the superchain Orbitz hyperchains is bringing in, and enable developers that are building on Solana, Aptos, other ecosystems to easily deploy onto these major L2s and have composability with what's already there. So yeah, obviously that brings on some more fragmentation. So yeah, really interested in discussing what chain abstraction and these interop solutions are going to enable for these teams that are onboarding and coming from other ecosystems.
Awesome. I'm Arjun. I'm one of the founders of Everclear. I've been in this space since 2016 and started Connect, which was what Everclear was previously called, back in 2017, with this goal of trying to figure out how to honestly do a lot of what we're talking about here, which is like abstract away the chain experience to get to the point where any user anywhere can use applications built on blockchains. Everclear is the first clearing layer. And what this means is that Everclear is a system that coordinates the settlement, or what we call clearance, of funds between chains, and specifically between different like liquidity-based systems between chains. And so like rather than going and building just yet another liquidity-based bridge, what we're doing is we're helping existing bridges coordinate their settlements with one another and net them up against one another such that everybody else's prices come down. Everclear sits as basically like a foundational infrastructure layer under chain abstraction protocols. It acts as this like backend liquidity mechanism that can then we can plug into like RAS and every new rollup that launches, and that then chain abstraction providers can leverage to come and like build support for every ecosystem really quickly out of the box.
Awesome, guys. Well, thank you all for being here. I think to start off, best kind of way to think about this conversation is laying out the way that Ethereum is scaling with rollups and chains, and kind of thinking about this from a horizontal scaling perspective. I think that's like pretty akin to modular, whereas I think vertical scaling is kind of akin to monolithic or kind of integrated designs. And we're seeing this happen now in Ethereum at a faster pace than ever. I mean, I'm sure Matt can tell us about the demand from the builder perspective to launch their own chain. And I think there's a lot of reasons to do so. And so I think to start this conversation off, I'd like to understand from your perspective what this modular fragmentation problem or kind of situation is today, and understand some of the trade-offs and pros and cons of scaling Ethereum in this kind of horizontal way. And Matt, maybe you can take a stab at it and we can go around.
Yeah. I'll start off. So I think you put it really well, where the Ethereum community, I think, has really coalesced around this idea of scaling horizontally across multiple different rollups, potentially, for all kind of intents and purposes, a practically, infinite, amount of rollups in the long run. At Caldera, like specifically, we're seeing like, dozens of people every month contact us looking for a rollup, and we sign, on the order of like around 10 teams every month or so, who each want to launch their own chain. So project out like a year or two, and also, expect some growth in that aspect. And like we will hit, a world very quickly where there are like hundreds of legitimate, rollups being used. The nice thing about rollups is that it allows you to scale while inheriting a lot of like the security and like some decentralization properties of Ethereum. And you are able to interoperate natively with Ethereum. So that's kind of like a solved problem, right? Rollup to Ethereum bridging and vice versa. The tricky thing is that, at least as it stands right now, natively at the protocol level, there isn't really great interoperability across rollups, right? Different teams have different kind of solutions in the works for this, right? You could have shared sequencing, could have superchain, egg layer, et cetera. But like as it stands right now, none of those solutions are truly kind of live in production. And so the ways that, rollups interoperate with each other and communicate with each other, it's still very up in the air. There are like a lot of solutions, a lot of competing solutions. And so from our perspective as a company that's launching a bunch of rollups, like we kind of view this as priority number one. And I do think it's like a little bit of a race for the like Ethereum ecosystem, because if we don't solve this, in due time, like the UX of the space is going to get extremely fragmented. So from our perspective as a company that's helping launch a lot of these rollups, we're very, very interested in seeing where this whole chain abstraction space is going, because we do view the end state as being, as a user, your wallet doesn't necessarily, it's not highly chain aware. You don't need to worry about like what server you're communicating with, what chain you're using. And, hopefully all this sort of stuff gets abstracted on the back end for users. So we, on the infra side, we're kind of hurtling down to that future, but we kind of need the UX to catch up.
Yeah, I think in general, this approach that Ethereum has taken to scaling is scalable to a certain degree. Even a monolithic approach like Solana or Aptos, you do reach certain thresholds, like let's say 100,000 TPS, which is what their advertising they can do in a lab. Currently, as we know, it's probably like around 3 to 10,000. But doing this roll-up scaling, you can scale linearly with the amount of roll-ups, at least in terms of TPS. They're just separate environments that are batching together the transactions, then posting to the L1. So I do think this was a better approach. It would have been interesting to see, and I know this discussion goes on sometimes on, what would scaling have looked at the ETH L1 level? Would that have been a better approach? But yeah, I think this this area of allowing open innovation to scale Ethereum comes with its downsides. Obviously, all this fragmentation that's going on, but solutions like this will enable people to just have a better user experience. I think we're quickly going towards a vision where someone can go into a wallet, just have an idea of what they want to do. Let's say I have this NFT that I want to sell, and then provision liquidity on a DeFi application, even if they're spread across, let's say, an Arbitrum rollup and an Optimism, and even potentially even a different L1. They can just do this all within one user experience and not have to worry about where they're clicking, whether they have enough funds, how long they have to wait, all these friction points. So I mean, in essence, as we scale in this more open way, that seems theoretically more scalable than the monolithic approach. We are running into these friction points, but it's good to see these solutions coming to market. And maybe the best approach is seeing it work within a small ecosystem or set of applications, and then scaling that out to more and more, where eventually the entire user experience doesn't have to feel so fragmented.
It's interesting because like this space is like none of these discussions in this space are like new, right? This whole debate around like vertical versus horizontal scalability was like a very key part of the like L2 scalability discussions in like 2018 or so, and it's just because like we at the time were like also talking about what will it take to scale up L1? Should we just make it harder to run nodes and like do exactly what Solana is doing effectively today? And I think like ultimately it just comes down to this like design question of like how much do you want to scale? And like the Solana thesis or the integrated chain thesis is really like there is a limited utility for blockchains that is likely going to mean like we can build like the future of finance on it, and we can build a few other things on it, but we're not necessarily going to need to scale to millions of TPS. There just isn't enough demand yet in the market, right? And so they're saying, okay, a practical version of scaling that has less trade-offs that we can do today that's good enough is going to be to like make heavier machines, right? And like to like do like just to optimize it at the VM layer. And that's true. That's all like a totally valid thesis. Whereas like the flip side of that is like people saying, well, no, like even though we may not have millions of TPS worth of demand today, like we should still build a system in a way that it scales to meet that demand. So that way we don't have to run into running into the exact same problem a few years down the line when we do hit that scale. I'm personally in the latter camp. Like I sort of saw this myself like 6 years ago when we first started talking about rollups, and like the discussion at the time around rollups was like, well, rollups are like a good enough solution to scaling. They give us 10x better scalability, and that's like enough for now. We don't see a reason to scale more than that. That already drops our costs from like $1 down to 10 cents. So that's good enough for normal users. And like by the time rollups actually were developed, the whole ecosystem scaled like 1,000x. It became a huge problem. And so I think we're kind of in a similar position where it's like we're not like forecasting out enough that like it's like how are users going to come here? They're going to come here when this stuff is like easy and cheap enough to use. Like every cycle, it's the same story. Like users try to enter this ecosystem, and then they fail to do so because it's too expensive and it's too fragmented and it's too difficult, right? And like until we get to the point where we're like, what? It doesn't matter if a billion users actually legitimately, and I don't mean that in the like hyperbolic sense that everybody always uses it, but like actually a billion users start to use blockchain. It shouldn't matter if it's that number or if it's a million, right? Like if we want adoption to happen, we shouldn't be making like a directional bet on like how much adoption should happen, because otherwise we're just going to run into the same problems again.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of elements that are trying to be solved in this conversation at once. I think there is kind of this element of, you get this chain abstraction from a more social user level, which is I shouldn't have to, in my mind, make these distinctions. But then I think that there's this kind of friction level as well that's also being solved. And whenever you get narratives like chain abstraction or something like this, it's always going to be the amalgamation of so many people trying to do something like 30% similar to what the current narrative is, all kind of coming together. But there is of course the North Star, and to Arjun's point, we've seen this narrative play out so many times. We've seen the app chain thesis become the modular thesis, right? And this conversation ends up not really being that new, but I do think that new issues do tend to come up. Like we didn't really see the amount of rollups that we did back in 2018, right? Like, and I think maybe the closest thing that we saw were like parachain options, which, I mean, didn't really come to as much fruition as we kind of thought. But I think there's this hypothetical land that like the conversation existed in, and then there's where it definitely feels now, which is like, wow, this is actually becoming a real issue. And what feels like looking into the future then becomes, hey, we're sprinting as fast as possible, and we just need to keep up because we continuously feel like we're tripping over ourselves.
Yeah, I guess just to maybe take a step back as well. We've been saying this kind of term fragmentation quite a bit over the past 5 minutes or so, and I think that fragmentation has always been a problem. It's not a new problem necessarily for just the modular approach to scaling. Fragmentation has been an issue between monolithic chains as well. The difference though is that when it comes to user experience, the issue of fragmentation between monolithic chains is less important to solve because, of course, we have this idea that there's going to be one blockchain that people are going to use. There's going to be one kind of global state machine that everybody's going to kind of collectively leverage to push the space forward. But as an ecosystem, I hate to use the word matured out of this idea because maybe this is putting down the Solana guys a little bit, but I think that as an ecosystem, as we've maybe transitioned away from this idea on the Ethereum level and moved closer to this kind of concept of ultimately scaling through the means of app chains, so applications transition into chains. This is presenting still fragmentation, but if every application is on a totally different, like its own state machine essentially, then this fragmentation becomes a much larger problem because now if between applications I'm losing my balance, I'm losing sometimes even depending if you're like moving VMs, I'm losing my address, my account, my infrastructure. So this is a huge problem because this means that not only is there fragmentation between 2 or 3 chains that are competing to be the chain that everybody's going to use, but rather as an ecosystem we're trying to move towards this very I would even say like closer to the Web3 ethos, like distributed mechanism of scaling, to where this fragmentation becomes a much more prevalent issue. So this is where I think that chain abstraction really has, and this is why chain abstraction has been picking up so much this year. Like, chain abstraction as a need, you could say that it's always been present, but it's so compatible with the modular thesis because modular scaling introduces the need for this degree of you could say interoperability. I think that there's a distinction between interoperability and abstraction. I think that these things sometimes get conflated a little bit, but I think that the need for this abstraction, this user experience boost, where users really no longer have to, for example, bridge between every application that they want to use or maintain different wallets for every application that they want to use. This is a problem that has exclusively been introduced through the means of the modular thesis. That wasn't necessarily as big of a problem when you just had competing monolithic chains. So this is where I think you start getting into the topic of chain abstraction and kind of this idea through the means of this transition that we've seen, especially within the Ethereum ecosystem.
I like that first point a lot, by the way. Like, you're totally right. There was absolutely fragmentation in the past. It's just like no EOS users were Ethereum users. Like, there was zero overlap between those categories. There was really effectively zero overlap between like Tezos users and like, whatever users. Like so the fragmentation didn't matter at the time. And like now it does, because like, yeah, Arbitrum users are going to go use apps and Optimism. Yeah, like all of the airdrop farmers are of course going to rotate through every possible chain.
Yeah, the on-chain world kind of changed it all. Yeah. Go ahead, Leo.
Oh yeah, I wanted to kind of pose this question to the group. Thinking about chain abstraction, how much responsibility is on the service providers to provide the information for the end users to understand kind of like where their assets are living? So let's take two roll-up ecosystems, Arbitrum and Optimism, that are pretty far along in decentralization and providing a quote-unquote trustless settlement to Ethereum, as trustless as possible. But as we know, others might not have. Permissionless proving doesn't exist in the fraud-proof ecosystems yet. But let's say in the future, when there is kind of like these different rollups that have that are at different stages of decentralization, how do chain abstraction solutions or wallets or where does the impetus fall to kind of like explain to the user, look, there are these risks if you're trading to these assets that are on these chain that potentially the sequencer might be compromised, so then you'll have to deal with fallback mechanisms that might take a week, or where does the balance fall in there, and how do you see this kind of evolving?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah,
I'm not going to answer the question, but just to echo like the question itself, I don't know if anyone noticed that MetaMask has put in a lot of these like warning messages now, and they're almost always wrong. Like a lot of times they have like they're like overly aggressive when they're alerting you about potential scams, and kind of just make you double check, which I guess is good, but it also adds a lot of like almost unnecessary precaution to like the application that you're interacting with. So yeah, where is the implication? Who has the burden of proving what is a scam, what's not a scam, where your assets are? It's a good question, Alejo.
I think on the chain level, when you're looking at specifically like who is responsible for like the integrity of users' assets based upon the resilience of a given chain. So, for example, like the integrity of a sequencer or something like this. I think that this is still so. Like users today, and we actually touched on this. There was another live stream that we did a while back, and we kind of got into this topic a little bit. But like users today, they trust applications to do a lot of things. So they trust applications whenever you sign a message. I mean, there's some degree of trust there in the applications you're doing a lot of the time, especially when it depends on the action that's happening. But users intrinsically have some amount of trust between themselves and the application that they're using. So the way that I see it, at least, is especially like with the introduction of chain abstraction, where you're going to have operations and assets across multiple chains. All of these chains specifically are going to differ in terms of resilience, in terms of security, in terms of just generally like what's happening with them at a given point. And the way that I see it, at least, is that this is just another point of trust that a user has to have with the application that they're using, because ultimately it's up to the application in terms of what chains are they interacting with. There's some points where like users, for example, might have assets on other chains that could be moved over to interact with an application, but I think still ultimately the trust usually is less so on the actual provider itself and more on the application that's being used, and it's up to the application developer to basically choose an environment that is secure and responsible for that user. And the applications that don't do this naturally aren't going to attract as many users, and there's going to be just like applications today that aren't trustworthy on other areas, they're not going to be used. So this is why I think that this really won't change the dynamic that much in the space. I think we're not going to see a huge shift in this regard. I think it's going to be pretty similar to what we see today in terms of trust, but rather you're just introducing this additional degree of trust with applications based upon the environment that's being used, and in a lot of cases being abstracted away from the user. So it's really up to the developer to decide this, at least from my perspective.
So to kind of add to that, like actually before I add to that, maybe just a little bit of context. So for folks in the audience who don't necessarily understand, like there is an ongoing conversation. There are a lot of like ongoing concerns around like what impact does chain abstraction have on security, right? Like you're kind of removing the direct interaction of the user with the chain, and so like you're abstracting away the potential risks that the user experiences. And I think that there's some like misconceptions around that. Like you're not like the user can still get all the information that they want about the chain or application they're interacting with. So like that's not going away. And in fact, by introducing this like third-party service provider that's like taking on the capital risk and the like reorg risk and things like that, in fact, like the user's risk is actually reduced, which is pretty awesome. So to that end, there are like meaningful security improvements that come from taking this approach. There are risks though, and this is one of the risks, right? Where you can have this paradigm where users never really ideally don't need to know what chain their assets are on. So their assets could end up on like totally random chains. They could end up on chains that are much more easy to 51% attack or whatever. And that is a meaningful risk. I think like the answer to this is like, so there's a couple of interesting things here. First is I think ideally the design pattern should be that like users are actually leaving their funds on a day-to-day basis on a more secure chain, and they're only like at the time of actually interacting with an application like risking like the small amount of funds that they need to risk as part of making that transaction or interaction happen for the few seconds that it needs to that the funds are at risk until the transaction is completed, right? So like in that sense, like the user's funds are still compartmentalized. Like you can still leave all of your capital on Arbitrum or on like the bigger chains, and it's only like at the time of interacting with like XYZ long tail chain that is like using some weird ass configuration that you actually touch that. And so I think that that's like something that people are really like not like misunderstanding as well. And then the other piece of this is of course that like you do get this kind of like separation of concerns. Like in the worst case, if as a user, if you are if you are worried about like the risk of interacting with like applications where you just don't really know what's happening, the nice thing is that you're interacting through a service provider. And because you're interacting through a service provider, like the service provider is the one that's really like really incentivized to be like, no, I'm actually not going to like service this application. So in this like app chain world, right, it stands to reason that it's very unlikely that for a very insecure app chain, like you're going to be able to attract solvers with sufficient liquidity to actually be able to do things there. Why? Because the solvers would have to go up front and hold liquidity on that chain. Solvers are obviously more sophisticated actors. I think they're businesses that have like capital at stake and they want to make sure that they don't lose their funds. So like if they're going and holding funds on this like XYZ long tail chain that is potentially vulnerable, like they are at risk. My feeling, I mean, it's a bit early to tell, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. But my feeling is that dynamic, that like specific economic incentive for solvers to really, really be very like self-preserving is going to result in like applications either having to like make sure that they have the security in place or just not being able to like support solvers in their ecosystems at all.
I think the like some standardization and social consensus around what makes something safe will also really help end users, and then the intermediaries like wallets, the chain abstraction, the solvers can kind of go through these standards. So for example, for the rollups, we have the different stages of decentralization, and then if that can be outsourced to a framework, like for example the super chain, the idea is that there'll be one bridge, ideally one sequencer that's shared across all these rollups. So individual rollups, as they spin up, don't have to think about maintaining a bridge with fraud proofs or validity proofs. They can just plug into what's existing as long as they meet certain thresholds. And then end users through intermediaries like wallets know that, okay, if this application is part of the Optimism Federation or the Arbitrum Federation, then it's relatively safe. It has a Lindy effect of this much time being alive. And that kind of starts to outsource. And yeah, maybe some warning signs like Robbie mentioned on MetaMask, like, okay, this is an entirely new, it's not adhering to any of these standards. It's a stage 0 in the rollup decentralization framework, et cetera. All that can come up. But then, I would imagine see some power law distribution of, most of the applications, most of the app chains accruing around these frameworks that, are standards for time-tested decentralization, and get to a level where the rollups are as trustless as the L1. So I think that could potentially be a future where you just get this aggregation around the federations where the standards are safe. Yeah, and this is kind of what we're betting on too, integrating into the major framework so that developers can feel safe deploying onto the Optimism superchain or Arbitrum orbits, etc.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point, also brought up here by Arjun and Tabasco, with regards to this idea of kind of interoperability being separate from chain abstraction. I think a lot of people think of this as like one thing, as Arjun kind of pointed to, and having these risk parameters for users at the application level, as Tabasco said, I think is one idea, but then also like educating people like on like what's happening on like the interoperability level could be something that maybe users don't care about, but could be interesting from a security perspective. And I wanted to kind of open this idea of this modular mullet. It's hard to say that with a straight face.
That you're getting, by the way.
Abstraction. Yeah, exactly. This chain abstraction on the front, modular blockchains on the back. But really, like, I think what we're really getting at here is like chain abstraction on the front, interoperability providers underneath or kind of like behind that make this happen. So I guess the question that I'll pose, and maybe I'll start with you, Burnt, is kind of what is the relationship between interoperability and chain abstraction, and kind of how do they play together?
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of goes to my narrative conversation earlier, right? Which is a lot of the chain abstraction narrative is exactly that, right? It's a narrative. And whether it be a lot of the old kind of intent narratives kind of coming over, or the bridging narratives, or the account abstraction narratives kind of coalescing into one. I think when you think about chain abstraction and you think about this concept where users shouldn't care about the chain, there is an element of interoperability to it by what seems kind of like nature. And I think looking at it and understanding it as a narrative, and understanding it as kind of a North Star North Star metric, if you kind of would, it's impossible to kind of get to a world where the user doesn't need to kind of know what chain they're on if they have to pick a chain, right? It's part of the actual problem. And so I think interoperability is extremely, extremely key in chain abstraction. And I think it's the ability to kind of be that first half step of saying, hey, this is an extreme functional issue that we need to solve for and kind of needs to be there. And as I mentioned before, right, we're sprinting, right? So we're trying to solve 15 problems at once. The way that interop kind of goes in with chain abstraction is because it's one of the problems that we need to solve.
Yeah, I guess just to add on to this as well, I think that, like I said earlier, I think interoperability and chain abstraction are sometimes conflated a little bit. I think it's important to like make it clear that chain abstraction is an abstraction. So it's, I mean, at the end of the day, it's there's a reason why it exists in the front of the modular mullet, because it's, a lot of the time somewhat more user-facing thing, and it overlaps a lot with interoperability. But I think the way that we've been positioning it and thinking about it, at least at Particle, that we actually published an article about this last week, is that chain abstraction as an experience. So first of all, we define this, and I think this is kind of a good way of looking at it, is that chain abstraction is ultimately an experience that results in a specific kind of like feeling for end users. So in this case, it's really an experience that lets users interact with applications without the manual processes that they typically have to go through to do multi-chain interaction, essentially. So bridging, managing multiple balances, et cetera. This experience is composed by a number of different things. And specifically, the way that we have defined the composition of this experience is through 3 layers. So you have the account layer. So this is more user-facing. This is basically what we build at Particle. So essentially, usually this is a smart accounts or some other kind of like EOA conversion mechanism that allows accounts to essentially have one balance that works across all chains. These are usually intent-centric to some degree. Then you have application layer chain abstraction, which is for developers and allowing them to actually compose across applications and whatnot and chains, and allowing them to be intrinsically chain agnostic. So, for example, Socket, Agoric, Cluster, these guys would fall in this category. And then what I would probably consider to be closest to interoperability would be what we use this term blockchain level chain abstraction, which is essentially just our way of essentially saying intrinsic interoperability between chains. This is where you see things like, for example, ag layer, or I would even consider like things like NodeKit potentially to fall in with this category to some degree, where it's creating a foundation of interoperability, which really is a lower level, more intrinsic thing between chains that then chain abstraction solutions benefit from intrinsically. So this means like chain abstraction exists, like especially on the account level and the application level, exists separately, but it definitely benefits from stronger interoperability standards. Although I wouldn't say that they are necessarily a requirement for one another. I think we already see a lot of chain abstraction solutions that work today that don't rely on super strong interoperability, usually because they use intents and whatnot, which can get around some of it. But I think that still, when you look at the two concepts, they're very closely interrelated, and definitely strong interoperability results in stronger chain abstraction in terms of really achieving this core experience. So this is where and why really we introduce this framework, to understand when you're looking at the experience of chain abstraction, it's achieved through the abstractions at the account level and at the application level, and then of course kind of tied together by the blockchain level, which really is just a fancier way of saying interoperability between chains. So this is at least the way that we see it and that we've kind of defined it at Particle.
Yeah, double clicking on that. We brought up the super chain. We brought up some of these different clusters of federated chains, groups of chains. The Arbitrum Federation, the Optimism super chain. When we solve, and then also kind of lumping in the shared sequencers approach to interoperability into that ag layer, NodeKit, Espresso, et cetera. When we're collecting in these, and I like that term for it, Ethan, like blockchain level chain abstraction as a solution for interoperability, call it shared sequencers, and we use that for interoperability at a lower blockchain level. What does that mean for chain abstraction? And Tabasco kind of alluded to it, like it makes chain abstraction stronger because maybe we have a stronger foundation. But when we're looking up the chain abstraction stack at intent solver frameworks and some of those tools, how does a shared sequencer affect kind of like those chain abstraction tools further up the stack?
I think Arjun made a point earlier around the solvers having their own demand for settling on some of these different rollups or chains. So I think that potentially could be an answer where if you have that foundational interop layer like validity proofs or a shared sequencer, then the solvers have more of a guarantee that they can move funds between these different chains easily. So they'll be more likely to, go out and solve, intents between these different chains. So I think that could be where kind of like that foundational, knowing that you can always use an interop layer, like validity proofs or a sequencer or a shared bridge, makes it so that there's higher demand, and then it's cheaper to do these intent-based, liquidity movements.
Yeah, like it's like the way to think about this is that all of that is like settlement, right? Like and I mean this in the like financial sense of that's the thing that like moves the funds at the end of the day for when you have the kind of batch transaction that's happening between the ledgers, which in traditional finance was like banks, and in this case is literally like blockchain ledgers. And so everything that kind of sits on top of that is basically like inheriting the like cost and security and other properties of what sits underneath. Now, like the nice thing is that when you're doing this using solvers, like the solvers have their own security model, which is like they're just like fronting the capital and like they are taking on all the risk. But like, you need to have mature interoperability mechanisms that are like robust and secure if you want to give solvers the best experience. Otherwise, like solvers are going to be increasingly hesitant to take the risk for themselves. And like the nice thing, and this is actually one of the big reasons for why like the rollup centric roadmap made so much sense for Ethereum, is like with rollups, you get that out of the box, right? Like interoperability is built into rollups. Rollups are all connected to the hub Ethereum L1 chain. And like that provides the base layer to go and build intent-based stuff on top. And then you can provide this like chain abstracted experience where solvers are still getting the best outcome. And as we move towards things like shared sequencing, right? Like we're basically just improving that outcome. Where like, the overhead that it takes for the solver to have to go and like negotiate, like to go and like rebalance funds reduces, or to go and like settle reduces, right? This is a core part of what like Everclear does as well. Is like it sits at kind of the center of all of these like independent settlement mechanisms, and then below all of the chain abstraction mechanisms. So it's almost like a negotiation layer between like all of the interoperability stuff that we talked about versus like the chain abstraction stuff that sits on top. And like Everclear kind of like tries to find what is the optimal way for those like solvers to settle, depending on whatever ecosystem you're in, whatever like security properties you care about, and like what kind of pricing you want for your liquidity.
Yeah, if I'll jump in here as well, I think that one of the kind of key insights that we're seeing is like a lot of these interop, kind of like I think Tabasco called them like sort of like chain level, deeply integrated interop solutions, whether that's shared sequencing or like the super chain, et cetera. Like they are really good solutions, but they're only end state solutions if literally everybody uses them. Otherwise, you still have fragmentation, right? Like you still have the problem, of connecting super chains to Arbitrum chains, or chains using Espresso to chains using NodeKit, something like that. So we think it's going to be really, really great to like, for new chains to spin up, be part of an existing network, as Arjun, mentioned, sort of like a standard for settlement that solvers find tractable, that they understand, and a security model that they understand. But like, I think like a lot of people in the space seem to think that, it's sort of like that, one more standard sort of approach, something will come up and out and like everyone will integrate it. It'll save everyone. I think like generally that's not the way that like the blockchain space plays out. Generally, the way that the things that can connect like literally everyone are these more, I would say, like lighter weight, flexible protocols, and I think sort of like a more intense-based mechanism is the thing that kind of bridges the gap between all of those. So we're going to see like a, very like a kind of mosaic of like all these different interop solutions that are connected by even more interop solutions. And I think that will actually be kind of the end state that we reach. As Arjun mentioned, sort of like banking, honestly, right? You have different countries, different standards, and like we figured out a way, over time to kind of connect everything.
I'm on mute. Matt, you were kind of joking around a little bit about Caldera almost being like the problem child of this conversation, where you guys just keep launching rollups. I'm curious, like from your perspective, based on your recent points here about kind of putting these different solutions together, like how are you looking at this from the rollup framework perspective in terms of contributing to solving the fragmentation problem? Like do like rollup as a service providers turn into like ecosystems themselves? Do you like build out some sort of solution for like, okay, all rollups within my framework or my RAS can have these options, so like you almost like give your builders a chance to like pick, a set, or do you open it up? Kind of like, how are you thinking about this from the rollup framework perspective?
Yeah. So yeah, I would say we're part of the problem, but we can also be the solution. The nice thing is that because we're a single team, we're operating all these rollups on behalf of our customers. We're able to make recommendations, as you mentioned. If as standards emerge, we're able to nudge people to different standards. And I forget who mentioned this, right? But when it comes to security properties of different chains, like we can make stronger guarantees as the operator of multiple different chains, where like, for example, that Caldera has never had a liveness failure. You don't need to trust, if the 50 teams we're working with were all running their own chains, you need to kind of maybe audit each of their DevOps setups individually to know, are they going to reorg? Are we confident in their ability to settle, right? But for us, like we run, the most kind of industry standard audited stacks. We run them in an audited, at this point, pretty battle tested cloud environment. And so if you want to like make assumptions, which I think basically every protocol needs to on rollup liveness, rollup security, et cetera, it's a lot easier to do that when we're running everything for a lot of these different chains than if every chain had their own, unique quirks in how they were being run. And so like, I think for us, how we're thinking about this is like, we're not going to push any, all of our customers to use one thing and one thing only, but like we want to work with like the best teams in the space who are, building solutions all over the stack. And we think like we can kind of help, act as sort of like a coordination layer for all these rollups and all these teams that are kind of choosing and trying to figure out like what to build and how to build it and who to work with. And hopefully that way we can kind of accelerate the space towards coalescing around standards and solutions.
So all these teams who need distribution here need to go to the rollup framework providers and basically work out the best deal possible to have their solution be recommended. And I'm just kind of joking around here, but the incentives are like, they're like what is the incentive for the teams who are building like similar products to collaborate, or kind of like in this chain abstraction stack, as you guys know, with the cake framework and kind of these different layers, like how do you guys foresee the collaboration happening and the incentives aligning for Particle and Everclear to collaborate with different applications and kind of build out a joint framework or a joint offer, if you will, to a certain developer or application?
Yeah, like this is a really, really good question. It's something that I've been kind of thinking about for like over a year now, because it's just like, this was my personal colossal frustration with how cross-chain played out, where like, it's a bit of a shit show in terms of how much fragmentation there is. And it's like super PvP. And like, the only reason for that was just because like teams were just not willing to modularize, right? There were teams that were trying to solve every single problem in the stack, and they were not like, because nobody really knew like, where is the value going to come from? Where are the users? What is the core problems that are worth solving? Teams went and raised tons and tons of money, and then we're like, okay, we have to solve everything, because otherwise, if we're not like the thing, like if we're not the interchain, then it's not worth it. And I think that's just like a fundamentally unsustainable way to think about things, right? Like the interchain is going to be colossal, right? It's going to be the future of the internet. There will be like trillions of dollars of value settled on the interchain every day. And like, it's ludicrous to think that that would happen through a single project. And so like, I think from my perspective, the answer to this is like upfront, the chain abstraction ecosystem has done a much, much better job of modularizing, right? Like there's a much more clearly defined set of like actors that are solving different problems. Like Particle and One Balance and other folks are solving like account layer chain abstraction to unify balances across a bunch of chains. Like Everclear does not care about that problem. We are not focused on that whatsoever. We want to work with other people to solve that, because like it ultimately helps us when that problem gets solved. And similarly, like there's not really a lot of point in Particle working to figure out how do we solve lower level solver problems. Like that's just like completely out of scope. I think that separation of concerns is really what is going to like, it's going to, at least my hope is that it ends up in a similar way to like the way that the modular ecosystem has actually played out, where it's like, yeah, you have competition, and like, of course that competition leads to a certain amount of fragmentation, but like at the same time, like the fact that you could have RAS providers exist is because there is enough unification around like, okay, these are the different pieces of the stack, and like roughly these are what the interfaces look like between each piece of the stack, that you don't have to go and build a custom implementation for every new integration anymore. I think like that, like the ideal outcome is we can get to the point where we standardize those interfaces, but to be honest, I think it's a little bit premature.
Yeah, I think Arjun said it really well, and this is an idea that we've also been thinking about for a little while, because I think it's quite important, especially to kind of create an environment like the modular ecosystem. And I think it's been successful to a degree where I think most projects have placed themselves now today within one of these core verticals and are focusing on one specific problem, which I think is the goal ultimately. Because I think I said this actually on the podcast that we did with the Roll-Up guys not too long ago. I think any project that is trying to solve or like be the chain abstraction project, this is an inherently unsustainable way to look at it. I don't really think this is how things are actually going to end up. So what I think is what's more likely, and to echo Arjun a little bit, I think that specifically the way that you look at competition and collaboration within chain abstraction, the same property can be applied to modularity and multiple other verticals in the space, is that you have competition, but horizontally. So you have the stack of different layers of chain abstraction, which we like to look at this from account level, application level, and blockchain level broadly. I mean, you can get more granular than that. But like in terms of just general solution categorizations, I think generally you're going to have competition horizontally. So for example, like account level solutions are going to compete with one another to be the choice of developers and users and whatnot. Then you're going to have application level solutions that compete with one another to be the choice of developers. And so like this is where the competition is. But vertically, there's no competition because these are interoperable solutions. They rely on one another to actually enable a full chain abstraction experience. So this is where you get what I would consider to be healthy competition, where really you from this horizontal competition, you actually have solutions improve because eventually you're going to end up with a solution that actually, for example, at the account level is the best solution for end users. Same thing with applications and so on, but you still have that freedom of choice. So, you could have some stack that uses a different account level solution, different application level solution, and then a number of kind of more foundational solutions below it. And it will still enable the same experience. But what's important is that you have that choice for developers, and there isn't, like 10 projects saying we're all doing chain abstraction. We're going to basically like who's going to be the one that kind of wins the race here. And that's why I said, in one of the last podcasts is that I think that the whole notion of like there being a chain abstraction race is inherently a flawed idea. I don't necessarily think that there is an actual chain abstraction race. I think that it's maybe if you look, maybe like in terms of the specific layers, but I think in total it is very much a public good idea and vision that we have for the ecosystem. I don't think it's necessarily something to be monopolized. And so as we achieve this experience, it is going to be something that's more kind of aligned with Web3 and modular ethos. So I think chain abstraction is itself modular, and this is a very important thing, especially when it comes to kind of collaboration and stuff like that.
Awesome, guys. I think we have to wrap up. I think we have to bounce. And I'm sure that you guys have a lot to prepare for. And next call is ECC, Modular Summit, Chain Abstraction Day, Integrated Day, Nebular Day, hundreds of side events. See you guys there. Thank you for coming on, as always.